Good morning and welcome to this morning's panel entitled Neuroscience, Religion, and Ethics, Moving Beyond Coexistence. My name is Raam, and I'm a neuroscientist, a postdoctoral fellow from Baltimore, Maryland. And it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you all my three co-panelists, who I'll introduce from left to right, your left to right. Dr. Paul Wolpe is a professor in the Department of Medicine and the director for the Center of Ethics at Emory University. His work focuses on the social, religious, ethical, and ideological impact of medicine and technology on the human condition. He's a past president for the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and spent 15 years as the senior bioethicist for NASA. Dr. Gillian earned her PhD in neuroscience from Emory University and is an assistant professor at Georgia Gwinnett College. Her postdoctoral research focused on science education and ethics, and she's traveled to Tibet with the Emory Tibet Science Initiative to teach neuroscience coursework to Buddhist monks in exile. She's also the managing editor of the American Journal for Bioethics Neuroscience. Finally, Dr. Karen Rommelfanger is an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Emory. Her work focuses on neuroethics, which is a rapidly evolving field that explores how neuroscience and its emerging technologies challenge our value systems, notions of self, free will, the mind, and human nature. She's the program director of Emory's Neuroethics program and the co-chair of the Global Neuroethics Summit. So we'll have an opportunity this morning to explore a little bit with the intersection between neuroscience, ethics, and religion. But before we do so, I think it's helpful to give the audience a little bit of context for this panel. And I was asked to share a little bit about how I ended up arriving at neuroscience as a field, which I think, as a Bahá'í community, we have certain beliefs about the harmony of science and religion, and growing up, that was a principle that I found particularly interesting in our faith. And as I navigated my studies, I just found that neuroscience, because it's interested in what it means to be human and tries to give scientific rigor to the study of human behavior, just seemed like an interesting angle from which to approach the harmony of science and religion, because I believe we need both systems in order to understand human nature. I also wanted to share a little bit about how this panel came into existence. So I attended a neuroscience conference this past November, less than a year ago, and there was a panel discussion at this conference that was titled "Interfacing with Religious Communities," and that topic is a little bit off the beaten path at a scientific conference. There's not typically conversations about religion at a neuroscience conference. And so, being a Baha'i, I of course went, and with a little bit of apprehension, to be honest, because that conversation between science and religion can be quite aggressive, as we'll hear about in a little bit. And so I was just excited to see what it would be, and what I found actually was a conversation that was very humble and open-minded, and actually very consistent with a lot of our own beliefs. And Karen and Gillian sat on that panel. And this was all around the time when it became clear that the AVS conference this year would be in Atlanta, so it seemed just very opportune to reach out. And so I did, and I said, I'm a Baha'i, and this is what the Baha'is believe about the harmony of science and religion, and we have this conference. It's going to be in your city. Are you interested in coming and having a conversation together? And as you can see, they responded positively and also suggested that Paul would be, okay, thank you, that Paul would be somebody who also would be so wonderful to include on this panel, given the work that he's done in this area. And so that's how and why we're here. So on behalf of ABS, thank you to the three of you for making the time to be here. And before we begin, I think it would be helpful for Paul and Karen to share a little bit about the Center for Ethics and also about neuroethics specifically as a field.
So I'll begin. First, let me say how delighted I am to be here. I've had engagements with the Baha'i community various times throughout my life, and it's just a pleasure to be able to be here to address you. I'll say a word about the Center for Ethics, and then Karen will give you an introduction to neuroethics. Our center is a unique center in the world. We're one of the very few large, comprehensive, integrated ethics centers in a university in the United States. Most ethics centers in the United States are bioethics centers because most of the money in ethics is in medicine and life science. And we've got an extraordinary bioethics program, but we also do ethics in religion, ethics and the arts. We have an amazing ethics and the arts program, one of the only ones in the country. We have a emerging food studies program. We have engagement with political and civil organizations. We train government employees in ethics. And we have one of the best programs in the world in neuroscience and ethics. We publish the main journal in that field. Karen has initiated a blog that has become the premier blog in that field. So we're an interestingly different center, and one that, find us online and follow us. We have some extraordinary programming. Just in this year, we've brought in John Brennan, former head of the CIA, John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, and in a couple months, we're bringing in Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, and just opened in Montgomery, Alabama, this extraordinary museum on the history of lynching and the African-American struggle in the United States. So I just invite you all to be partners with us in this center.
Thank you. So it's also my great pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for Tara to taking the chance on our panel, and for listening deeply and to working so hard to engage us in an exciting conversation for us. This is new to me to be introduced to the Baha'i faith, and I've been very intrigued by our conversations and even the opening devotions today. It's fantastic. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the field of neuroethics, which Tara did well, concisely in my introduction. It's really a very new field, a little over a decade old or 15 years old, depending on how you want to count it. Paul is actually to blame him for the founding of the field. He's one of the founders. And really it became clear there was something unique about neuroscience and the way it had a capacity to change the landscape of the way we live. And it seems that as neuroscience has evolved, and I myself am trained as a neuroscientist like Tara, it's become very clear that things that we once thought were foundational about our lives and ourselves, like our personality, how and who we love, are all more fragile than we once thought, through whether it be brain disease, whether it be injury, or whether it even be the new technologies we can use to intervene with your brain. So because of this, neuroethics has become a rapidly developing field, and the concerns of neuroethics have registered at the highest levels of governments around the globe now. And this is because people see the potential for neuroscience to challenge many of the ways that we live, to inform our legal systems, to inform how business happens. And the reason I run the Global Neuroethics Summit, which was mentioned earlier, was an attempt to bring all these governments, to bring all these scientists together to talk about how we could do science and collaborate across these geographic regions and across differences and shared values in belief systems. So having this conversation today is very much in line with what we do in the neuroethics program. And as Paul mentioned, we have the journal, and there's sample journals out there. We also have a What is Neuroethics out there. And we have some samples from our blog, and I also want to say that we should also blame Gillian for getting me involved in this, because she and Paul were the ones who initially seeded the ideas to have a neuroethics program to begin with, and we're fortunate to have brought her back to Emory from Gwinnett, actually, where she leads neuroethics in the undergraduate neuroscience program.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll go ahead and explore some questions together. And before we do that, I just wanted to mention that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of our discussion in the form of email submissions. So there's an email address which hopefully will show up on screen soon, but it's neuropanel@gmail.com. Thank you. So if you have questions that come up for you during the course of the discussion, feel free to email them, and I'm actively checking and can field them. So the first question, and I know that we've touched upon this in our conversations before, is about the idea that the Baha'i teachings support a framework in which science and religion are conceived of as two complementary bodies of knowledge and practice. And this stands in contrast to other threads of human thought in which science and religion are thought to be mutually exclusive and incompatible with each other, as well as other frameworks in which science or religion is attempted to be explained with the language of the other system. So for example, the ability to force science to conform with religious reasoning, or to force religion to conform with scientific evidence, both of which the Baha'i community would not necessarily agree with. But the idea that science is a form of knowledge is pretty easily accepted, and doesn't take much to convince people that science is a form of knowledge. The idea that religion, however, is also a form of knowledge is not as readily accepted, especially in academic circles. So I'm wondering if the three of you can comment on some ways in which insights from religion can actually serve as a form of knowledge.
So I always think that comparing religion on one hand and science on the other hand is an error of category. I don't think they're compatible. Science has a single unified set of principles that it uses, whether you're a social scientist or a physicist or a neuroscientist. Religion is an extraordinarily diverse set of human behaviors. I just got back from Dharamsala, where Gillian has spent a lot of time, and the Dalai Lama has spent a lot of his last few years with trying to convince people to associate with his concept of secular ethics, by which he means that all major religious traditions have as a fundamental underpinning the idea of compassion. So if we can all start with compassion, maybe we can get by our sectarian differences and come together over an ethic based on compassion. Well, compassion, of course, is an affective trait, not a cognitive trait. We have theistic religions and atheistic religions. So I think to say, how is science compatible with Baha'i? How is science compatible with Judaism? How is science compatible with Buddhism? Is a much more fruitful conversation than how is science compatible with religion? Because I think what you do when you ask that question is you have to blend what makes religion distinct and beautiful into one broader category. One last quick anecdote about that, looking at the other side, science's view of religion. Andrew Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania, where I spent most of my career, colleague, is the founder, one of the founders, of the field called neurotheology, where neuroscientists look at religious behavior as it is expressed in the brain. And he put monks and nuns and meditators into brain scanners and tried to say, what does the brain look like when people are engaged in what we think of as religious behavior. And what I always like to point out is, I won't go into detail, but he described the components of the brain that were inhibited and expressed during these states. So for example, you always hear that people in states of religious behavior, religious experience say, there seemed to be a dropping of the barrier between myself and the universe. I felt one with the universe. Well, there's a specific part of the brain that does actually make the differentiation between self and other, and that part was inhibited during meditation. So exactly what people describe is exactly what a really good brain scientist would have predicted the brain would look like during that behavior. That's fascinating, but that's not the fascinating part to me as a social scientist. The fascinating part to me was when they published it, they got two reactions. Scientific skeptics said, you see, it's what we've always been saying. Religious experience is an artifact of the brain. It's not a real thing, it's just a perception. The religious community said, you see, God has exquisitely designed the brain to know him. So the scientific finding didn't change anyone's mind. It was just interpreted through the lens that people brought to it.
Thanks, Paul. Those are excellent comments. One area that you mentioned that I wanted to expand on and maybe differentiate a little bit is, as you wonderfully described how diverse and brilliant the fabric of religion is, and how we can think about science and Buddhism, science and Christianity, science and Baha'i. I also think that science itself is probably just as diverse. There are some sets of laws and guidelines that follow along the same order, but generally, if you talk to a neuroscientist and a physicist or a molecular biologist, they're slightly different ways of knowledge, of gaining knowledge, slightly different sets of tools that we use. And I think in that same way, we can recognize slight differences in the way we approach thinking. And I do think that as we're comparing and looking for symmetry or points of departure for some of these disciplines, that it's important for us to recognize that they're all a little bit different in their disciplinary development and where we've come from and where we're going or what we're looking at. I find also, anecdotes about how human behavior responds to this potentially fraught areas, when we think about questions that really drive who we think we are. And we're looking at some of the questions of how and why. And as a scientist, I think, trained as a scientist, one of the best lessons I learned was that we're not particularly good or exceptional at finding out why we do things, but we're really good at how. And I think the domain of science is really figuring out how we approach things, how we do things, and breaking that down, and we can examine that on many ends. But I think what religion does, and in different religions, they put the why in there. That's the motivation. How we are doing something we can explain, but in a lot of cases, why still eludes us scientifically. And I think that bringing those perspectives together adds dimension, and using them in ways that do not conflict, but can complement each other. I think, if I have a scarf and I wanted to describe the color as well as the texture of it, there are different words I would use and different ways that I would draw on my experience to describe this to someone. And I think that science and religion provide us opportunities to do that, to describe things in different ways.
So I see science as really a system. It's a community. It's community-based work. So it doesn't exist without, part of its methodology is it requires peers to kind of check each other's work, to verify each other's work. It requires the community to agree to a certain methodology. What's important about that is while the methodology strives to be objective and to be free of any kinds of subjectivity and opinion and feelings and things like that, ultimately, at the end of the day, the science and the methodology is used by humans. So what kind of topics people choose to research, what they think is valuable to do, and what is it contributing good to the world, how they interpret the findings of those research are all based on values and assumptions that people bring with them to the world. And a lot of those values and assumptions are brought through spiritual, religious beliefs. Even if one declares himself to not be religious, it's hard to escape the legacy of religion within different cultures and societies. So I think it's really important to be honest about that when conducting your work and thinking about the implications of your work. And this is kind of the spirit of one of the projects I'm working on now, to talk about these values and unearth these values from a conversation that we typically think is free from value because it's scientific.
It's really helpful, thank you, to clarify both science and religion as bodies of knowledge. Maybe we can now move a little more specific into the particular discourse between neuroscience and religious communities. So what do you think have been the strengths of that conversation, and what have been the main sources of tension in that conversation?
I think I'll start here actually with not answering your question, but introducing something else. When we talked about this panel, one of the things we actually talked about was whether or not we were going to do a science and religion or a neuroscience, because we thought, is it too broad? Can we narrow it, focus it enough? And I wanted to make sure that we are thinking about what the neurosciences are contributing that is somehow special or different. And I think that might illuminate where we go in the conversation as to what is it that is different about neuroscience as a discipline extracted from the sciences that would make us need to spend more time on that. So I'm just inserting that.
So what is different? What is different is that, at least in our current conception of humanity in the scientific West, the brain is the center of all of those qualities that we think of as most intimately and innately us. So our memories, our personality, our sense of humor, those are all, we believe, brain traits, or primarily brain traits. Think about the difference between, someone going in and performing an operation on your kidney and someone going in and performing an operation on your brain. We think of those very differently because we worry far more in the latter case about whether we're going to be the same individuals after the surgery that we were at the beginning. And brain diseases are diseases where, if you work, for example, with Alzheimer's patients, or if you've had this experience in your family, you often hear the following phrase: well, dad isn't dad anymore, right? So that brain experience changes and somehow fundamentally how we think about ourselves. And because of that, and because religion also has a very strong basis in the brain, as we saw from Andrew Newberg's research, the connection between neuroscience and religion can be profound. And finally, because some neuroscientists try to explain religion entirely through neuroscientific ideas and findings, and that is kind of unique. I'll give one example why it's not entirely unique. I'm a sociologist, and as a graduate student, I did my comprehensives and my work in the sociology of medicine and the sociology of religion. And sociology tries to explain religion also, but they try to explain it as a group phenomenon, not as an individual phenomenon. In psychology, they try to look at it as an individual phenomenon. And so neuroscience tries to drill that down to a biological phenomenon. And I think that that's where neuroscience differs from the other sciences in its relation to religion. Want to say something?
Okay. Yeah. I actually see the discourse evolving in that there is something very special about neuroscience and understanding neuroscience in that its expectations of what it can know about human life, like about memories, about personality, those expectations are really high for neuroscience, but what neuroscience must remember is that it's just one tool in the toolkit of understanding our world. And so in making sense of the knowledge that we're acquiring, you have to reach out to other disciplines. And I see this as one of the gifts, maybe the tensions and gifts. So the scientist, maybe in particular the neuroscientist, because of the types of questions the fields assumes they ask, have to come with a certain kind of humility and recognize that they cannot maximize their findings for good without drawing other people in. And sometimes that means you're going to have to get religious perspectives. Sometimes that means you're going to have to draw upon fields of medicine, from neuroscience, from sociology, you name it, to get the full picture of how that work can have its impact.
I've been summoned to speak directly into the microphone. So one of the ways in which the Baha'i community sees science and religion as being compatible with each other and coherent is that both of them have the common aim to generate knowledge that alleviates humanity of its sufferings. And one suffering in particular that neuroscience aims to address is that of the problem of mental health. So neuroscience, because of the methods that it uses, tries to address mental health through the use of medications, antidepressants, more recently technologies such as brain stimulation, where a particular part of the brain can be stimulated in order to relieve an individual of the symptoms of depression or anxiety. And yet, and this is something that neuroscientists themselves will admit, it's not a harsh criticism from an outsider, but it's important to note that despite our best efforts, our mental health is actually getting worse rather than getting better, especially in our young people. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the role that religion might play in this discourse on mental health and how we might need to draw on insights from religious communities about the nature of the mind and the nature of suffering in order to address the question of mental health well.
So as I said, I'm a sociologist, and in my first year of graduate school in sociology, I realized something at a profound level that I hadn't quite gotten before that. Emile Durkheim is called the father of modern sociology, and he made his reputation in part on a book he wrote called Suicide that was utterly groundbreaking. What was groundbreaking about it? He took 3 countries, England, Denmark, and Italy, and he showed that they had consistent suicide rates from year to year, but that their suicide rates were very different from each other. They were consistent over time, but Denmark's was the highest, then England, then Italy. And he asked the question, why? And his answer, after a lot of complex sociological thought, was because the lowest rate was in Italy, which had a very strong, cohesive religious commonality, the Catholic Church, which was very well defined, hierarchical, and the values and behaviors in the Catholic Church were very well understood. Next was England, the Anglican Church, which is really just a Protestantization of the Catholic Church. And so they were a little looser, they were a little more congregational and a little less hierarchical, and their suicide rates were higher. Scandinavian religion is entirely congregational. There's no hierarchy, there's no cohesive whole. Every congregation kind of makes its own decisions about a variety of different moral stances, and they had the highest suicide rate. And his conclusion, which of course has been elaborated and refuted, but all of these things, but it gets to an essential point, was that suicide rates, which before Emile Durkheim were always, people didn't think about rates. Suicide was something that an individual did in the midst of their anguish, a kind of individual decision that didn't have a social dimension. He showed that you could predict next year how, and this doesn't sound remarkable to us, but imagine how it sounded before people believed this. We can predict with precision how many people are going to commit suicide in the United States next year. Think about that. We don't know any individual's anguish, yet we can talk about suicide as a social phenomenon. That was Emile Durkheim's great contribution to human thought. But what that means, and the reason is what he called anomie, or meaninglessness, that in a society where you don't have a coherent sense of meaning, people tend to get more fragmented, see themselves as isolated, and are more likely to kill themselves. His sociological point that founded the field was a profoundly religious point, though he didn't think of it that way, which is that if you can bring coherence to people's life and a sense of meaning and a sense of commonality after ultimate objectives, you can decrease suicide rates. So when we think about mental illness, as Karen said so beautifully before, there are levels, there are contributions. You have to think about things at different levels of aggregation. We can think about it on a social level, we can think about it on a neuroscience level, but those are always informing each other.
Paul just highlighted suicide, which is probably quite an extreme result of some different mental health issues that we have, and they're numerous and they run a spectrum of different mental health issues. But as you mentioned that, I thought a particular case about how religion interacts with our body of knowledge. And I was raised Catholic and I'm practicing Roman Catholic, and I but also a book nerd, so studied the Catechism of the Catholic Church and have noticed that over time, our relationship with what it means to commit suicide has changed. And so the laws before, up to a certain point, where, if it's an unforgivable sin and this is a fracture with the relationship with your God, and that there is no way to come back from that. And at one point, you couldn't have a church funeral if you committed suicide. There's all sorts of different things embedded around that. And I think the culture took some of that on, including how you represented it to others and how much you acknowledged it and how much stigma was attached to it. So while our mental health issues may have changed over time, may have gotten worse, may not have improved, it might also just be that we're looking at it through different lenses and different perspectives. Because the perspective now from the Catholic Church is that if you are that outside of yourself, right, this is dad's not dad anymore, or we're not, if your identity has changed enough that you find that committing suicide is the only way, you may not be responsible for your decision or moves during that time. And so there's a little bit more forgiveness associated with taking such a drastic measure. And that is a huge evolution in what a church or what a religious denomination will do for with information and with the scientific knowledge that we have based on what we've learned from psychology, sociology, neurosciences throughout the years. There's been a different approach to how it's, so are we identifying more cases? Are we more open about it? Are we talking a little bit? Addiction is another area where the education surrounding some of these mental health issues might be different, so we might not be having more cases, we're just talking about them a little bit differently. And so in terms of, predicting how many people, we might be able to do that. Are we doing enough to moderate that? Are we doing enough to stem that off? We probably have a little bit more work to go in that area, but looking at the cultural context and the religious context, there are things that are happening in specific areas and accommodating change and thinking about how we handle some mental health issues as we move forward.
Okay. I think this interesting point about rates of depression increasing doesn't necessarily reveal that there are more people with depression. It might just be that we now know more about depression, so we can identify it. And this happens with a lot of diseases. That said, I think although maybe we are understanding depression a little bit more, we really don't understand depression or, frankly, mental illness or what is mental health at all. And this is really consistent across the globe. And the former director of the United States National Institutes of Mental Health has himself said, I don't think we've moved beyond a developing country in our ability to address mental illness. And we really haven't, and that's largely because a lot of mental illness is related to functions in the brain, and the brain still is the least understood, most complex organ that we've got, that we've faced. That said, we are neuroscientists are trying to test the waters to see what can they understand and really know about mental illness. And they do that, and to do that, you have to use the tools you have. Science has certain tools and certain questions it can ask. It can ask about certain functionings of the brain and then try to connect that to behavior, but trying to connect those biological mechanisms to manifestations of behavior and mood has been really tricky. But as we reveal that we know about what kind of mechanisms are related to the manifestation of depression or schizophrenia or a number of mental illnesses, what we also find is that the people who have those illnesses interpret that information very differently based on the communities that they're in. So you might say that we found the biological underpinning of your addiction, right? And so now people say addiction is a brain disease. And that campaign has been heavily supported by the National Institutes of Mental Health with the hope that if we could biologize this addiction, for instance, it would be something that would take the blame off of the person. It's not just that you have a weak character. This isn't a moral failing. This is just your brain and beyond you, right? And and depending on which study you look at, sometimes it's the case that actually the idea that the addiction is a biological disease can alleviate stigma, right? Because families can understand, oh, you can't get over this. You can't just go do yoga. You can't do whatever, and you're going to get better. On the other hand, some people who have hear that, people have reported and studies have shown that if you suggest there's a biological mechanism, people feel like, well, this is just how I am, so how am I supposed to change? I have no role in this. So we have to be very careful about that. And the way that stigma is manifested, those negative feelings about the person's blameworthiness for their disease, seems to be different depending on what kind of culture and community you're in. So there have been studies that shown if you're in a collectivist community, and that's one who identifies yourself as a product of your relationships, that the stigma actually may be greater, right? Because if you're broken, so is everybody else around you, so you might hide it. So this is something we're still getting to try to understand. And so I think what religion offers in this sense and I think this is what Gillian was alluding to, is a sense of community and how this is going to be interpreted. How is your community going to lead and interpret this knowledge, biological knowledge about yourself? And how does it interpret its responsibility to caring for that person?
That's all so helpful, thank you. And I think also to add in, I think the Baha'i perspective on that as well is that I think at least the Baha'i teachings support an idea that we live in a very materialistic society, and one that is dominated by rampant consumption, and also one in which, despite living in bustling urban environments, people are quite lonely. And that it's almost, I would say, normal to respond to that kind of an environment with a degree of anxiety and depression at times, and that I almost would wonder if you don't feel a little bit depressed in response to that, if that's the normal response. And so I think there's a tendency to pathologize a response to an environment that comes from certain social forces that maybe that's actually, it's not pathological, it's quite normal to feel that way. And so I wonder if the attempt to try to understand mental health in terms of the brain only helps us understand how an emotional state has a physical basis, but doesn't necessarily help us to understand where that emotional state is coming from to begin with.
Tara, can I just comment on that?
Please.
So if you take something like ADD or ADHD, if you watch a cat, ADD is what cats do, right? Because they're hunters. It's what every hunter does. What you want to do if you're a hunter is you want to have kind of a diffuse attention and then be able to hyperfocus when you see your prey. That's what ADD is. People with ADD don't have attention deficit disorder. They have a selective attention disorder insofar as it's disorder, because they either have diffuse attention or hyperfocus, and they don't have that middle level of attention that most of you are displaying right now, where you're sitting casually and relaxed but listening. Now, when we're in a hunter-gatherer society, that's an adaptive trait. They're the great hunters. When you move them into a modern society where you expect an 8-year-old kid to sit for 6 hours in a classroom, it's a maladaptive trait. So the issue isn't a brain issue, it's a context or environment issue. And so mental illness cannot be defined entirely or even usually by brain states, but by the context in which those brain states express themselves.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you. We have one more formally planned question, and then we'll move into the questions from the audience, which are plenty. So there's a quote from the Baha'i writings, which I find fascinating as a neuroscientist, that I thought we could explore together. It says, "In the treasuries of the knowledge of God, there lieth concealed a knowledge, which when applied will largely, though not wholly, eliminate fear. This knowledge, however, should be taught from childhood, as it will greatly aid in its elimination. Whatever decreaseth fear increaseth courage." So the Baha'i writings are not explicit about what the form of knowledge is, but given that fear is a behavioral state that many neuroscientists try to understand, I'm wondering if we can comment a little bit about how neuroscience might be a field that helps humanity overcome its fears and may generate courage.
You want to start that?
I last semester I was teaching a behavioral neuroscience class, and one of the areas that we looked at was fear. And one of the things we try to do in this class is bring primary literature in for the students to read, like what is the current research, and see how they can relate it to our traditional understanding of how these mechanisms operate. And I thought I'd mix it up a little bit, and I pulled a paper that showed evidence that implicit bias, something we all have for different things, could be modulated or dampened by beta adrenergic receptor blocker, which for some folks you might be familiar with the heart pills. It dampens your adrenergic response or adrenaline response, right? So if your heart rate is accelerating and all the stuff that goes along with the fight or flight response, it sort of dampens that. And there was Liz Phelps' group who administered propranolol, which is this drug that does that. That's its job. And they found that giving this drug to folks reduce their implicit bias, not their explicit bias, not your bias that you are aware of or acknowledge, but the bias that you don't know you have. So when they showed a group of white men pictures of African American men with good or bad words, you can monitor the reaction time and see how long it takes for someone to associate a good word with a face of other, or a bad word with a face of similar kind. And this drug reduced the reaction time, that is to say, reduced implicit bias. Now, this is potentially a fear mechanism that we're looking at, some implicit biases that you have and how you feel about in and out group and who scares you without you actually knowing who scares you, who drives you to vote in one direction or another because you're afraid of something that you don't even know you're afraid of, can be modulated by looking at your fear responses. I had it's a class of about 115 students, and I got some pushback. But we had a really lively discussion about what motivating behaviors are and how fear plays into that, and how you can tinker around with that system with, decreasing sleep, or how agitated people feel. And I'm not talking specifically about any religious interaction here, but sort of our community and how we think about what fear propels us to do, and how we look at studying what that means.
I've always, look, human beings are very anxious animals because we were prey, right? We don't have claws, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't have a turtle shell, so we're tasty morsels for those predators out there. And so because of that, for our history, we developed this anxiety, which often manifests itself as fear, but it's basically, the base of fear is anxiety. So we're fundamentally anxious animals, and how we handle that and manage that and modulate that is part of how we manage ourselves in the world. Religion can be a mitigator for anxiety if it's used in a healthy and productive and communal way, or it can exacerbate anxiety if it's used in a punitive, repressive way. And I think we can see 1,000 examples of that throughout history, and perhaps even today in many places, the present place not accepted. So there is no part of the brain that has been more studied by neuroscientists than the amygdala, which is in some ways the seat of all of that, anxiety and fear and those kinds of things. And it's a really fun and easy part of the brain to study. And so neuroscience may have, Liz Phelps that Gillian brought up is a perfect example of this, where she really got us thinking in a slightly different way about the nature of prejudices and biases in not only that study, but other studies. So neuroscience really can help us understand and illuminate these processes that we often think of as social and psychological and provide a kind of new way to think about it.
Yeah, I think you guys covered it. That's it. No. No, I think that there are specific fears that some people have, and we can talk about those, and some of those are known to us and some of those are unknown, like the implicit bias that generates all the isms. And then there is this kind of generalized fear and existential crisis, and I'm not sure how much neuroscience is going to do for that in a specific way. I think that the reason I like neuroscience is because I know that it will be almost impossible to completely know the brain, but that doesn't keep me from trying to understand it. And there is a certain kind of comfort that I have in, I'm not complacent, I'm not sitting back passively, but it reminds me that there's always something I don't know, and it's important to remain, kind of curious and humble and kind of faithful that I'm doing the best with what I've got. And I really see that as something that is an important way of thinking about science as one piece of knowledge. And it can be kind of a practice that reminds us the limits that we have. There is one specific fear, I guess, that's kind of interesting in sci-fi, which is we almost universally have a fear of death. I'm not sure how strong that is with people out here, and I couldn't see your faces anyways because there's lights on them, so you can make whatever face you want. But that seems pretty universal. And there's this idea, and I think a lack of humility of some neuroscientists to think that we're going to be able to distill down the essence of human life and human existence through the plain circuitry of the brain. And if I just know what's happening in my brain well enough, it'll be a series ultimately of zeros and ones like anything else that I can save, that I can recreate, and maybe even put into another body. There are serious scientists working on this kind of project, actually. There are people who are trying to create models of the human brain and simulate the human brain who will secretly, sometimes openly admit that to you. And I think there's an important ongoing dialogue that needs to happen about what kind of life we want to live. I think religions are in the business of kind of talking about how we can live a good life. What is a meaningful life and what is good? And I think in that case, it might be important to bring in those conversations to people who are thinking that life can be distilled down to a downloadable pattern in your brain. But if you want to check out, there's a 2045 initiative has a webpage where you can, to the tune of $3 million, you can begin to design your own avatar for your body, and by 2045 they will be able to actually put your downloaded brain in the body. And interestingly, on the front page is a picture of the CEO/developer of this initiative shaking hands with the Dalai Lama, which is a kind of surprising mix.
So these are the kinds of questions that neuroscience will try to tackle in the coming years with whatever degree of effectiveness. I want to make sure we have time to explore some of the questions from the audience, which are fantastic questions, and a lot of them are very similar, so I may not get a chance to read all of them word for word, but I'll summarize the main themes. There are several questions in here about the nature of consciousness and about the idea of whether consciousness resides in the soul or in the brain or a combination of both, and to what extent neuroscience can or will be able to explain something that seems A, hard to define to begin with, and B, fundamentally irreducible. So maybe we can explore that a little bit.
The brain is the single most complex thing we know about in the universe. Not just the most complex organ in the body. The human brain is the most complex thing we know about in the universe. One of the things we've come to understand that we don't understand is how qualities emerge from complexity. So things at different level of complexity have new emergent qualities that you would not predict from studying their component parts. You can study an axon or a nerve cell of the brain from now till forever, and you will not understand why the Mona Lisa is beautiful. right? Because it's at a different level of complexity. And that idea of beauty emerges not from any single component of the brain, but from the complex structure of the brain. So does consciousness. I have a little pet theory that I don't often talk about, but my theory is that there's a basic law of the universe that nothing can understand its own complexity. So we're using the brain to try to understand the brain, and it may not be up to the task. Right?
Exactly what I was going to say.
The scary piece of that is, our brains are far more complex than the connections are far more numerous than every connection of every computer together on the internet. We're far beyond that. We're not even close to that with the internet yet. But there may be a day when computers do get sophisticated enough to pass us in sophistication and complexity, and then maybe at that point, computers will understand human consciousness, but they won't be able to explain it to us any more than we could explain it to a dog, because it'll be so far beyond us. So that's my prediction of the future of humanity.
Yep.
I didn't know I felt like. Nature of consciousness. That is tough because I'm not sure even the people in this room would have a consistent definition of consciousness. I know scientists don't. I know clinicians don't necessarily do. Now, on paper, there is this attempt to scientifically quantify aspects of consciousness, like awareness. And that's generally kind of what we use when we think about disorders of consciousness. There is this question of what would you be trying to measure with consciousness? And this has been these conversations have actually come up with the group that I sit on, which is the Neuroethics Work Group of the National Institutes of Health, Brain Initiatives. We're the Neuroethics Division or Neuroethics Work Group. And we've discussed recently this idea of human brain surrogates. So to understand the brain, to understand the human brain, ultimately you need human brains or something really close to it. And the closer you get to a human brain, the more morally concerned we become about working with that. And so there have been some scientists who, like Christoph Koch, who have, from the Allen Brain Institute, who have worked really hard to try to come up with these calculations and these models that would give you the requisite features of consciousness. But I don't know how many people would actually agree with him. I don't know how many people who would be subject to those criteria would agree to him. And what we've wondered, though, is there's this example right now of trying to grow parts of the human brain in a dish that we could work with. In fact, maybe I could even take, maybe in a near future, I could take a biopsy from each of your brains and I could culture that in a dish and grow it, and I could test drugs on that might be effective specifically for you. I could see how well you might do with a certain level of anesthesia or things like that. That is maybe a long-term hope. But as we cultivate, let's say we cultivate just the front part of your brain, the cortex, and then we start putting in the cerebellum, how much of that do we need before we start saying that this item now is no longer something that is cell culture, this is something that needs to be under the heading of human subjects research? If it experienced pain or discomfort, would we know that? And is there a certain amount of suffering that we'd even be able to detect in it so we could protect it? So these are actually concerns that people are ongoingly dealing with. And also, as we have, all this to say is we just don't know. We continue to wonder. If we implant parts of your brain into a non-human primate, at what point do they develop a sophisticated enough behavior that we start worrying that they're too human and they now resemble some sort of human level of sentience? These are not questions, though, that science will answer. These are questions that we as a society will agree upon. And actually that will continue to shift. So even death, brain death, or the moment we define death, I think Paul has said this before, we don't know actually when anybody dies necessarily. We just know after you've died. Definitely after a certain point, this person is dead. But the moment that they died, we wouldn't agree upon that, and that certainly differs across religions. But legally, we need to operationalize that. But right now, even in this country, legal brain death, which is the way we can determine if you're dead, is not the same as biological death. You're just dead enough so that it's okay to take your organs and give them to someone else. You're dead enough so that it's prognostic, it's not diagnostic. It tells you that you will die at one point. So again, those broader questions are not questions for neuroscience to answer alone, but to help to answer.
That's excellent thoughts. I was thinking about this summer, I had an opportunity to teach Tibetan monks living in exile in South India neuroscience, and we were at the monastery we were working at. They had a new abbot, and so I got to sit at the enthronement of this new abbot, and so part of welcoming the science team, the neuroscience team who was there at the time of his enthronement, they organized a conversation for the neuroscience faculty and the new abbot. And they wanted the conversation to be around consciousness and Buddhist definition of consciousness and the scientific definition of consciousness. So there we are, 10 faculty, a pair for each of the 5-year curriculum that we were teaching. And we sat around trying to decide on what 5-minute presentation of consciousness we could agree on. And, long story short version is we could not figure out what the consensus was scientifically on consciousness. There's a lot of definitional issues, operational definitions, consciousness as awareness, consciousness as soul, consciousness as presence, and we just weren't able to nail down exactly what we meant. So consciousness, attention, are you conscious or aware of what you're doing? And there's just a lot that we were not able to do. So I do think it might be one of those questions that's a little outside of the domain of what we can really, really understand. But that doesn't mean we're not gonna keep trying. As Karen mentioned, you're not gonna sit there and do nothing. We still try to understand some of it, and so we're looking at it from different perspectives, but in terms of, I think there are a lot of definitional issues that we would have to get through before we can start to hammer away at that.
By the way, some neuroscientists have just tried to dispose of that question by saying there is no such thing as consciousness. It's epiphenomenal. What we think of as consciousness is just our brain informing us of its decisions, and our recognition of those decisions is our conscious process, and that in fact we make no decisions at all consciously. We make, we are not in fact conscious beings. We're beings that are run by what happens in our pre-conscious brains, and this whole conscious world that we think we believe in is actually a phenomenon of our brain informing us, whatever that means, by the way, of what it has already decided to do, and that gets into issues of free will and all of that. That's a very real conversation happening in neuroscience, but part of its purpose, I think, is to explain away consciousness so we don't have to really confront it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll move to another theme which seemed to be a common thread, which is questions about justice. So there were a few questions that ask about the nature of trauma. So I'll just read this one because it's beautifully articulated. It says, in light of the growing interest on the impact of trauma, such as complex trauma on the development of children who experience abuse or neglect, or the impact of racism and generational trauma on populations, do you think neuroscience has a role to play in helping society gain a better understanding of questions of justice? What are the limits of neuroscience in this regard? And do you think religion could become a constructive part of this discourse? Are there dangers of bringing science into this conversation?
So yes, there are dangers of bringing science into it, but science is strongly in it. We just have to be cautious. So 2 quick examples. Martha Farah, neuroscientist, has done work on neuroscience and poverty, trying to show that conditions of poverty and development can change in a detrimental way brain development. Or Adrian Rain, who is a criminologist, who did this amazing study. There was one area where, because of a political situation, it got cut in half, but the 2 sides were integrated. They had been, one community for a very long time, and because of that, one side had nutritional deficits. They couldn't get food they needed for a period of time while the other side could. And then they came back together, the political situation resolved. And he followed the children from both sides, and he found a much higher degree of criminality and criminal behavior in the group that had had a nutritionally deprived childhood. And his argument was that that nutritional deprivation had impact on the brain in such a way that they were less versatile and less able to find constructive ways to behave in the world, as well as perhaps less impulse control and things. But the point of both of those neurological types of studies is to argue that, yes, it's a very strong argument to make. When you make the social argument, people from deprived areas become criminal, the argument back to you from regulators and government can be, well, that's their fault. They just need, yes, we understand, we see the trends, but they need better self-control. When you make the argument that their brains were deeply impacted by it and we can show it neurologically, it's a lot harder to say, yeah, but they just need self-control. The bad side of that is, okay, let's medicate them. Let's try to fix their brain through giving them a pill. So I don't think of it as good or bad. It's this, scientizing a problem relieves politicians of their social obligation to fix it. Because as soon as it's an illness problem or a biological problem instead of a social one, you turn to the doctors and you turn to the pharmaceutical companies instead of making the kind of social reform that's really necessary to fix it.
I think that science has increasingly become a moral authority. Sometimes that's challenged, and you need to use that authority carefully and responsibly. So there's this cartoon I've seen where there's the evolution of the justice system, and it starts out with trial by ordeal, where it used to be that, let's say someone thought you were guilty of a crime. Well, if you would be not guilty if you reached your arm into a pot of boiling oil and your arm came out unburned, right? Because the gods were protecting you. So there are a lot of guilty people at that time. And then, there's trial, kind of came to this trial by peers, right? So now you have this, a courtroom, and you're called in to serve on a jury. And now that science is moving, neuroscience is increasingly moving into spaces of trying to understand decision-making, thought processes. Now it's kind of trial by science. So now science is becoming that authority that is being brought in to make the decisions, that somehow it'll be better than a jury. So we talk about this, and these are some of the examples that Paul brought up. And then there are these, and the example Paul brought up earlier too, the neurotheology, where people said, we related this information to the brain, and see, there's no God, and see, the brain was exquisitely designed to know God. We know, actually, from psychology experiments that people just tend to use scientific information across the board to affirm already held beliefs. It's more rare that people actually change their mind after that. And neuroscience, we also know from studies, is particularly powerful and compelling. So people see, it can be an image of the brain, it can be bars, it can be text of the brain, and we've consistently seen that if we give you a nonsensical text in a story, that you will believe its conclusions if we just include even text that neuroscience said this was so. Throw in a brain or something else that is visually stimulating, and you'll be even more convinced. So now we think about neuroscience is very compelling, and I have this very good thing I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to be more just. I'm trying to distribute goods more. I'm trying to prevent people from being subjugated and undermined. And so why don't I just use this science that kind of fits with what I already believe? And it's a hard temptation to resist, because even the science with Martha Farah, which is great and talks about how poverty can change the brain, and maybe that should make you more compelled, because we all believe the neuroscience. Now that will make you more compelled to actually do the right thing. It might not in the end actually help science and the faith in science and the trust that science has tried to earn, because the science is not quite there yet in making those kinds of conclusions. So I think if it is presented in a situation where you're trying to advocate for something which is legitimately good, it should just be presented fairly and know that it's easily abused and misunderstood.
So I think we'll have time for one or two more questions. There are a number of questions about the nature of ethics. And what are the limits of a secular system of ethics is one question that has come up. And the other is there even for those who say they have a secular system of ethics, are they really free of the influence that religion has on that framework?
So I'll start. The Western world is characterized in its history by creating secular theories of ethics. That's what the Greeks did. That's where the word ethics comes from. There is no word for ethics in the Hebrew Bible because they didn't differentiate behaviors. How you should behave to another person was no different than how you should behave towards God, or how you should or the rules you're supposed to follow. That was all how you should behave. It was the Greeks that cut out of that how you behave towards other human beings and called that ethics. And God was not involved. They came out with these Aristotelian and then starting and then all the way through Western history, analytical and Western philosophers have tried to create systems of ethics that were based on rational premises. So yes, we can easily create systems of ethics based on non-religious premises and take them all the way to the end. What's a little harder to do is to say why you should listen to them, why you should adopt those systems of ethics. There, I still think that there are ways you can make that argument secularly, but religion, I think, makes that argument much more powerfully. As my brother, who's a rabbi, likes to point out, if you go to Africa and you find 1,000 people who are there from the West because they, who are there as Peace Corps workers, who are there, trying to help in some way or another, 999 of them will give at least partially a religious reason why they're there. Because in religious systems, it's easier to argue why you should be moral and why you should be of service and selfless. That doesn't mean it's not possible in secular systems, and that doesn't mean that, as I've heard religious people to say, if there's no God, there's no reason to be moral. I don't buy that for a minute. But I think religion lubricates that process a lot and makes it a more easier and more compelling in many ways.
Okay, great. So I think we have time now for one last question. There was one question in particular that came in that is asking the panelists to give their advice to the young people in the room who are at the threshold of making decisions about their education and their career. And in particular, one person asked about advice for women who want to pursue a career in science. So there's an opportunity to share your advice. Now is the time.
Apply to Emory.
Neuroscience and behavioral biology program. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And maybe a little outside of the scope of the panel, but I take opportunities for all. I would encourage young folks who are religious, because I imagine if you're here, you have some kind of religious affiliation, to be willing to ask questions and to continue to be curious. I think in the scientific enterprise, that's what's prized, right? It's the curiosity, it's the seeking information and knowledge. And I think in some religious practices, I'm not as familiar with Baha'i, but I know in some religious practices, there's less of an interest in questioning things and more about following directions and staying in line. But I found for myself, I'm sharing my personal experience, that I did all the right things growing up and I went to all the classes, and then it wasn't until I had my own crisis of faith where I really asked all the questions that I came to a fuller, deeper, beautiful understanding of what it meant to have my own faith perspective. And it's unshakable with my scientific practice. And there are a lot of scientists who are somewhat dismissive of having a faith practice along with your scientific, because it seems incompatible for many. And so the confidence I had to develop in maintaining both those identities took some work. And so if that's you, work at it, keep at it, and ask your questions, and persevere despite what the others might say.
Thank you very much. This was a conversation that I enjoyed very much, and I think based on the questions that came in from the audience, we all enjoyed. And again, thank you all, to the three of you for making the time, despite very busy schedules. And we'll see the rest of you in the evening for the evening program. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.